want to thank Kevin and my friend Ramiro for setting up this meeting. It's really an honor to be invited out here. It's a beautiful campus. I actually used to live just a few streets down in Flushing back in 2012, but I never actually came by here, so it's an honor to come here. So if you tune into the news and you watch what's happening in Venezuela currently, it's really a lot like walking into a movie about an hour and a half after the movie started. You really don't know who these people are and what they're saying or where they came from, and you know what's happening on the screen at the moment, but you don't really know the backstory and you don't really know what's happening. So in order to talk about what happened in Venezuela in December, I have to talk about the history of the Bolivarian movement. And in order to do that, I have to talk about neoliberalism and explain what neoliberalism is. Neoliberalism really came into prominence in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Economists in the United States at a place called the Chicago School developed ideas about creating what's been called utopian capitalism. The idea was that almost all government intervention in the economy could be abruptly ended. Minimum wages, labor laws, environmental protections, and they could be gotten rid of. Functions usually carried out by the government, like prisons and the military and public transportation, could be relegated to private corporations. Now, the Ford Foundation and the Rockefellers and a lot of think tanks put a lot of money into Milton Friedman and other economists who developed these theories of developing kind of almost completely unregulated capitalism. And the first place that neoliberalism was put into practice was in Chile in 1973. The democratically elected leader was Salvador Allende. He was a member of the Socialist Party, he was a Marxist, and he had a pro-Soviet foreign policy. And he was overthrown in a military coup. With the help of the CIA, the military toppled Salvador Allende and put in a military dictator, Augusto Pinochet. And then Pinochet essentially handed the economic management of Chile over to the Chicago School of Economics. They immediately privatized all the state-owned enterprises. They abolished a number of the social programs, and they turned Chile into a laboratory to conduct an experiment in economic neoliberalism. The result was 20 to 30% unemployment. They got rid of the food subsidies that had existed under the previous government, and as a result, the average Chilean family began to spend about 74% of their income on food alone. The average calorie intake dropped to about 1,200 calories per day. There's actually a number of Chileans who were small children, 1 or 2 years old during this period, who became permanently mentally disabled because of malnutrition that they had as a result of the drop in food prices, the mass economic devastation of Chile. But U.S. copper and mining corporations got rich, and the wages of Chilean workers went down, and that was the beginning of neoliberalism in Latin America. About a decade later, there was a coup in Argentina, and Isabel Perón, who was leading Argentina, kind of a nationalist leader, she was overthrown, and neoliberalism set up shop in Argentina as well. Now, what began in the southern cone of Latin America greatly expanded after the collapse of the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc was declining, and Marxism and socialism were losing ground in the world, neoliberalism began to greatly expand. The International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank forced many Latin American countries to reorient their economies toward neoliberalism with loans. Essentially, in order to receive IMF or World Bank loans, you had to follow the dictates and the policies dictated by these institutions. In Bolivia, the economist Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University was brought in to oversee the privatizations. Sachs mandated that Bolivia privatize its water resources, and it actually became a crime in Bolivia to collect water even on your rooftop. If you were collecting water on your rooftop, that was stealing from Nestle and other corporations from the United States that had been given control of Bolivia's water resources, so you could be arrested for it. In Ecuador, the international bankers forced the country to rapidly switch to the U.S. dollar and give up their currency. And interestingly enough, I actually went to Ecuador. This was in 1999, and it just devastated the country. I mean, mass homelessness, mass poverty. I mean, it was just a disaster. Now, Venezuela is an oil-rich country. It actually has the biggest oil reserve in the world. They've basically come to the conclusion now, petroleum geologists, that Venezuela has a bigger oil reserve even than Saudi Arabia. For a long time, it was believed that Saudi Arabia had the biggest oil reserve, but now Venezuela has the biggest. But in the 1980s and 90s, the oil, it was technically nationalized, but it was really the property of BP, Royal Dutch Shell, Chevron, and ExxonMobil. Those are the four super majors, the four Wall Street oil corporations that function almost like a trust. They don't really compete with each other. Some people call them the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the four major U.S. oil corporations that are connected with big banks. ExxonMobil is basically Chase Bank, and it's the Rockefeller family. Royal Dutch Shell is also a Wall Street institution. Most of these big oil companies are linked to big banks and linked to media, and it's kind of these are the centers of economic power in the U.S. are these banks and oil corporations. Now, in the 1980s, with the threat of communist revolution no longer hanging over the heads of the capitalists and the leaders of the government in Venezuela, they began to cooperate with the International Monetary Fund, and they cut social spending very rapidly. The results were horrific. When I visited Caracas, people told me horror stories from this period. Basically, the international bankers would say to the Venezuelan government, in order to receive your loans, you need to cut your spending on government workers. So, they would look at the budget, and they would say, wow, you've hired way too many people in the sanitation department. You've hired way too many people to manage the electricity. And so they would have to cut the budget. And so they would cut it one year and lay off all kinds of workers. And then the next year, they would come back and they'd apply for their next loan, and the international bankers would say, oh, you got to cut some more. And the results were just horrific. People told me that during this period, in a lot of neighborhoods in Venezuela, the electricity would just go off for weeks, and they would have no electricity. They would talk about how garbage would stop being collected because they wouldn't have enough garbage workers to go out and pick up the garbage. And so for weeks, garbage wouldn't even be collected in some of the poorer neighborhoods. So when the government raised the cost of public transportation, again, they were being told by the international bankers, look, you've got to cut, you're spending way too much on your public buses and trains. And so when they cut public transportation and raised the costs, there was a huge riot, a huge rebellion. They call it the Caracazo. And it was just a huge upsurge in the whole country. It wasn't just in Caracas. That was the center of it. That's where most of the fighting went on. It was all over the country. There was just a huge outpouring of rage and anger at the cuts in government services that were being mandated by the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. And shortly afterwards, a military commander named Hugo Chavez, he tried to seize power in a military coup. He was seen as an ally of this mass uprising against the cuts in public services and the economic devastation of the country. He tried to seize power in a military coup. It failed, and he was put into prison. Now, in Cuba, there were conferences going on with labor activists and communists and socialists and progressives from all over Latin America. And they were gathering in Cuba and talking about how to fight against neoliberalism. Fidel Castro, veterans of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, many different leftist and revolutionary leaders were meeting in Cuba and strategizing what to do. Now, in the 1970s and 80s, revolutionaries in Latin America used primarily guerrilla warfare. They would pick up guns and try to seize power with military arms and establish a new government. But in the 1990s, as neoliberalism was going on all through Latin America, economically devastating it, there was a tactical reorientation. And revolutionaries and leftists moved away from this armed strategy and began to adopt tactics that can be described as what they call a people's front or a popular front. Instead of trying to take power with arms, the revolutionaries would build alliances with other political forces, and they would use a method called polarization. They said the issue in Latin America was neoliberalism and the privatization and the cuts in government services and just the devastation of the economy. And the goal was to divide society into two camps, the people that were for neoliberalism and the people who were against neoliberalism. And everyone would basically be faced with the question, are you for the neoliberal cuts? Are you for what the international bankers are doing to our countries? Or are you against it? They would sometimes use religious and patriotic imagery. They would say that, that we're the real patriots. We're the ones who love our homeland. And these leaders that are obeying these folks on Wall Street and cutting all the services, they're traitors to the homeland. They would build alliances with churches and religious organizations that were just having to care for people and seeing the neighborhoods and the parishes just devastated by these economic cuts. So in Caracas, for example, in the 1990s, when the electricity would stop coming on in the poor neighborhoods, the communists would lead the community to shut down the major roadways with tires. They would pile tires in all the major roadways, light them on fire until the electricity came back on. They would just shut down these roadways. They would also have symbolic one-day strikes. If the electricity wasn't coming on in the neighborhood, no one goes to work. And they would make sure everyone in the neighborhood knew that they weren't going to go to work that day. And all kinds of businesses would have, their workers wouldn't come to work, and so they would respond and the electricity might come back on in a few days. One thing that they did is when the garbage wasn't being collected, the Communist Party would start collecting the garbage themselves, and then they would take it to a major highway and dump it in the middle of the highway, demanding that, and then of course the government would have to respond and start collecting garbage once again. These were kind of community struggles that kind of built the strength of the left, and they built a coalition, a political party that was opposed to Western domination. It was called the Movement for a Fifth Republic. In Venezuelan history up to then, you'd had 4 different constitutions, 4 republics, and then they built a political party called the Movement for a Fifth Republic. The military leader, Hugo Chavez, who had attempted the coup, he ran for president in 1998, and he said he was not a socialist, that he believed in what he called the third way between capitalism and socialism. And he ran on a modest platform, and it was basically, he was saying Venezuela first. He says we need to stop listening to these Wall Street bankers who are just wrecking our economy, and we need to put the needs of our country first. They called themselves the Bolivarian movement after Simón Bolívar, who was the liberator, the leader of the revolution against Spanish colonialism, and who had abolished slavery in South America. He'd been key in getting rid of slavery. So right after Chavez was elected president, the country was struck by mudslides. After heavy rains, entire villages were just destroyed, just the mudslides, and people were displaced. And so using the television, Chavez got on television, and he basically mobilized the country to help the victims of the mudslides. He used the military, and he basically called up a kind of patriotic spirit of community service. He used the community activists and the people who've been leading these kind of fights against neoliberalism to go out and organize their communities to help the people as a result of the mudslides. And this was something that hadn't been done in recent history in Venezuela. There hadn't been this kind of mobilization of the people to kind of help each other. And it was an extremely popular thing, and people were all kind of whipped up into this patriotic fervor, going and volunteering and helping people in their community who'd been devastated by these mudslides. And so as a result, Chavez was very popular. And so after the mudslide crisis was over, he then called for a new constitution, and they had a national vote, and the new constitution was ratified overwhelmingly. The rich and powerful in Venezuela started getting somewhat afraid at this time because they saw that Chavez wasn't just leading the Venezuelan government, and he wasn't just leading the Venezuelan military, but he also had this network of kind of community activists who could kind of be called on to come to his aid and do things that he wanted to do and kind of push forward what he called the Bolivarian process, or the Bolivarian revolution in the country. And that made the rich and powerful very nervous. In neighborhoods, they organized what were called Bolivarian circles. And so every neighborhood would have people who were supporters of the president and supporters of the movement for the Fifth Republic. And when he got on TV and said, we want to push this initiative, they would go and knock on all the doors in their neighborhood and talk to people. And this kind of gave Chavez a level of power that other political figures in Venezuela had never had. One thing he did, after passing the new constitution, they had a literacy campaign. And Cuban teachers were brought to Venezuela, and they went from neighborhood to neighborhood teaching people who were illiterate how to read. And the first thing that they ever read was this new constitution that they had passed. And so that was very popular. So then September 11th happened in the United States, and a few months later the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, began bombing Afghanistan. And Chavez on national television got on TV, and he showed pictures of innocent people who'd been killed by the bombings. And he said, now 9/11 was awful, but it doesn't justify the killing of innocent people. And what the United States is doing in Afghanistan is wrong. And a lot of people in Venezuela agreed with him and supported him in that call. And then shortly afterwards, Chavez appointed a member of the Communist Party to his cabinet and said, he may be a member of the Communist Party. I don't care. He's the best guy for the job. And he appointed him to a job in the government. So in response, there was a coup. Leaders of the military, in cooperation with the CIA, they arrested Chavez, and briefly he was taken out of power. But then the rank-and-file soldiers, the lower levels of the military, who really loved Chavez and loved his new constitution and his literacy campaign, they rose up and they refused to cooperate. And pretty soon, after a few days of being taken out of office, Chavez was back in power and stronger than ever. Now, in 2003, a year after the coup, Chavez announced that he had changed his position. No longer was he for the third way. He actually believed that Venezuela should move toward what he called 21st century socialism. And Chavez restructured the Venezuelan government-owned oil company and basically kicked out BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Shell. He kicked them out, and basically so that the proceeds from the oil sold by the Venezuelan government-owned oil company actually went to the Venezuelan government. And what happened around this time also was the U.S. invaded Iraq. March 19th, 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, and one of the biggest oil-producing countries in the world was blown up. It was just destroyed. Now, we all know about supply and demand. What happens then? When one of the major sources of oil on the international markets is destroyed, there's an increase in demand. And so the price of oil skyrocketed. And then shortly after that, the U.S. put sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran because they were developing a peaceful nuclear energy program and they thought it could be used for a nuclear weapon or something like that. So Iranian oil was moved off the market. And then tension increased between the United States and Russia. Russia's another major oil exporting country. And so Russian oil was pushed off the market. So as a result, you had oil prices around this time that reached the levels of like $110 a barrel. Really huge oil prices, some of the biggest we'd ever seen. And as a result of that, the Venezuelan government suddenly had a huge amount of money. And so with the proceeds from Venezuelan oil, Chavez started doing a lot of very, very popular things. A lot of things that made him very, very popular with the Venezuelan public. For one thing, he built healthcare clinics all throughout the country, and he imported Cuban doctors to come and give free healthcare to people in low-income neighborhoods. He set up a network of community-controlled radio and TV stations that basically broadcasted an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist message. I actually visited one of these radio stations in Caracas, and it was kind of amazing. It was, it's a very low-income neighborhood, but there's just this beautiful, like, state-of-the-art theater that's connected to a radio station, and people use it there for, like, talent shows and community programs. And there's a radio station that's totally controlled by the community. If you live in the neighborhood, you can apply and get time on the radio. It's just beautiful. And when I saw this beautiful state-of-the-art theater paid for with government money, with the oil money, with the oil revenues, I asked the people in the neighborhood what had been there prior to the building of this beautiful state-of-the-art theater. And they told me that what there had been in Venezuela before that, and in this neighborhood, what there had been, is this had actually been the place where people who stole cars would come and break the cars apart, right? And it had also been the heroin place. If you wanted to go buy heroin, this was the place. And so to have the empty lot where people broke apart cars they stole and sold the parts, and the place where people sold drugs, turned into a community center with an auditorium and a community radio station. That had just done amazing things for the neighborhood. It had made it a lot safer, and it had just been amazing. Venezuela already had free public education in the universities, but there were only a few universities, and they rapidly expanded the public university system. When I was in one of the neighborhoods in central Caracas in December, I asked one of the community organizers who was taking me around, I said, how has this neighborhood improved? And he just pointed to all the houses. And he said these houses were all built with loans, interest-free loans given to the people by the government. And they built their houses. Before that, people had lived in shacks without electricity. Now they have electricity, running water, and free cooking gas, by the way. Everyone in Venezuela, every household is supplied with free cooking gas. These are amazing steps that have been taken, and they were done with the high oil prices. Venezuela, with the biggest reserve of oil in the world, selling oil on the international markets, was able to give all of this to their population. Now, U.S. media around this time started talking about Chavez the dictator. Now, we've all heard this. If you ever hear Chavez referred to in the media, or his successor Maduro, you hear them called dictators. But every election, the United Nations, the Organization for American States, the Carter Center for Free Elections, and so many others have confirmed that the election results are legitimate, that this is how the people voted. But yet, our media continues to refer to them as dictators. Now, there is a small minority in Venezuela of very wealthy people who hated Chavez. But in the working-class neighborhoods in the cities and in the countryside, Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution at this time had overwhelming public support. Chavez was elected again and again. Now, as Chavez was dying of cancer, he emphasized that the Bolivarian Revolution needed to move ahead. He said that there should be communes that were created, and a lot of his followers actually began doing this. They began setting up like kind of collective apartment buildings where they would all kind of live together and share everything. And he said that oil couldn't be the only thing in Venezuela that was used to create the socialist project. He said that Venezuela needed to move toward building like government-owned steel mills, collectively owned steel mills, and other manufacturing, and that because they were centered around oil, this was kind of a weakness for the Bolivarian Revolution. And he also called for Venezuelans to form militias. He said that they needed to form basically armed groups that were independent of the standing military. And so in Venezuela, there's actually 117,000 young people who are not part of the Venezuelan army, but they have guns and they have military training and they're in their neighborhoods and they have weapons and they consider themselves, soldiers to defend the Bolivarian revolution with weapons if they need to. Now, after Chavez died, Venezuela had an election and elected Nicolas Maduro as the new president. Maduro is a longtime labor activist. He was actually a leader of the bus drivers union, and he's been a key figure in leftist politics in Venezuela for many years. Now, Maduro won the election undisputedly, but afterward there was an episode of bloodshed in the streets of Venezuela. 47 people were killed. There were wires that were strung across intersections, and people riding motorcycles would ride across and get their heads cut off. There were universities that were bombed. People threw, petrol bombs at the public universities, which were considered a symbol of the Chavez movement. There were also some community health care clinics that were bombed. There was a campaign of violence. There was a hashtag created on Facebook, SOS Venezuela. And there was actually a lot of disinformation that was spread on the internet at this time. For example, it was spread on Twitter and on Facebook that the Venezuelan police were open firing on people with live ammunition. And there was a video circulating that showed some shooting going on, and it gave the impression that the Venezuelan police and military were just going around shooting people with live bullets. In fact, what was happening was they were shooting rubber bullets at a crowd, which is commonly done when there's violence at demonstrations, in all over the world. But this false information was spread to kind of create a moment of panic. In addition to this, now that moment, they called it La Salida. It was a campaign. The hope was to drive Maduro from office with this kind of campaign of street violence. It died out, but it created a lot of disinformation. There was a lot of confusion, and almost a state of national emergency was called. Now, then starting in 2014, there was a massive drop in oil prices, right? Now, Venezuelan, the Bolivarian project had largely been successful because of the high oil prices, $110 a barrel. But then all of a sudden, in 2014, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia starts pushing oil onto the international markets massively. There are tens of millions of dollars, millions of barrels of oil being pushed onto the international markets every single day. And Saudi Arabia is actually bankrupting itself. And this continues. They're still doing this. Every day, Saudi Arabia is pushing oil onto the international market, and they're losing money in doing so. And they're having a huge internal crisis. People are being laid off in Saudi Arabia. Why is this happening? Well, it's happening because Saudi Arabia is basically the property of the four major oil companies in the U.S., Chevron, BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil. And in coordination with the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the major think tank of the CIA, they've kind of engineered a strategy to oppose enemies of the United States. What do Venezuela, Iran, and Russia have in common? They are all countries that have rejected the dominance of Western capitalism. The Iranians are Islamic revolutionaries, the Russians are nationalist Christians, the Venezuelans are Bolivarian socialists, but all of them reject Western capitalism and have an independent economy. And they all have basically state-run economies that are centered around the public control of natural resources, especially oil and natural gas. Russia, Venezuela, and Iran have all developed and become strong because of independent economies and because they sell their own oil. They sell their oil on the market, and that funds a government apparatus which then subsidizes a domestic independent economy. I guess I want to take a sidetrack at this time and point out that imperialism does not bring development. Here in the USA, we're often taught to think of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America as if these places are just naturally poor. That's the way we're taught to think of this. But the Middle East is where civilization was born. Latin America had vibrant civilizations like the Incas, the Mayas, and the Aztecs, while Europeans were still hunter-gatherers living in caves. China was arguably the most powerful country in the world at one point, and it's pretty close to getting back to that position. There's no reason that people in the so-called third world should be poor, and the Western powers are not developing these countries by investing. In fact, they're destroying and creating dependency. You look at Mexico, for instance. Decades of intervention from the U.S., ultimately escalating with the North American Free Trade Agreement, has not made Mexico more prosperous and self-sufficient. It has reduced the country to chaos as drug cartels battle each other with U.S.-made weapons, and U.S. corporations control the economy, getting richer, while Mexico itself gets poorer. The domestic agriculture of Mexico has been eliminated, and now Mexico imports food from U.S. manufacturers. When the British went to India, they saw the vibrant textile industry that existed there, and they didn't fund it and expand it. They burned down the textile mills and forced the people of India to import their cloth from Britain. The imperialists are very good at fomenting civil wars like they've done in Syria and Ukraine and Yemen, They're very good at drone strikes. They're very good at expanding the narcotics and drug-related activities. You know, Afghanistan is now the heroin capital of the world since it was invaded by the United States. The U.S.-backed and funded paramilitaries in Nicaragua and Colombia actually brought us the modern cocaine industry as well as the drug known as crack. But when it comes to feeding people, teaching people to read, and building infrastructure like highways, schools, hospitals, and such, Western imperialism has proven that it's not so good at that. So when I was in Venezuela in December, I saw that the Bolivarian revolution was facing a crisis. It's not where it was back in 2006 or 2007. It's actually in a deep crisis. Food corporations in Venezuela that are the property of private corporations who hate the Bolivarian government have been smuggling food out of the country and creating false shortages. There's actually a shortage of other products as well, like toilet paper. Toilet paper is very hard to come by because these corporations that are privately owned have been sending it to Colombia and other countries and basically creating shortages. This is economic warfare. One of the biggest problems, I think, that the United Socialist Party has at this point is they have a big problem with corruption. You know, in Venezuela, over the years of Western capitalist domination, people learned to take care of each other. In Venezuela, if someone got a job with the government, they were expected by their neighbors and their family members to help them out and take care of each other. It was basically a means to survive. You know, if you have a job in the government, your friends and neighbors expect you to break the rules and bend the laws and help them out. And this is a way people learned to take care of each other when there was extreme poverty in the 80s and 90s. And this goes on everywhere in the world. I mean, here in New York, people are taking bribes. Corruption is a big problem. And when the oil prices were high, this wasn't as big of an issue because there was so much that people still got what they needed. However, as the oil prices have been dropped intentionally, now there's low oil prices and there's shortages, this has created a much bigger problem. Now, furthermore, the opposition in Venezuela has actually had a complete makeover. They've completely changed the way they talk. For a long time, the parties that ran against Chavez and Maduro in the elections would speak in very vulgar terms. They would actually call dark-skinned Venezuelans monkeys. That was actually a really common thing. On TV, opposition candidates would say, well, you know, all the people that are voting for the United Socialist Party and Hugo Chavez, they're all a bunch of brown-skinned monkeys. That was acceptable. Now, of course, people don't like to hear that. That's ugly racism, and people didn't vote for it. And the Venezuelan opposition also used to really talk about capitalism. And they'd say, capitalism is a great system. Look at the U.S. It's capitalist. It's the richest country in the world. Chavez wants to make us a poor communist dictatorship like Cuba. Well, this message didn't really work. It wasn't really working with the Venezuelan people. So the current leader of the opposition in Venezuela is a guy named Enrique Capriles. Now, Capriles says he's a socialist also. Instead of preaching this kind of vulgar anti-communism, instead he talks about helping the poor and fixing the economy, but he says he can do a much better job than Maduro. Now, it's no secret that Capriles is an agent of Wall Street. He gets lots of U.S. money, and he's been trained in Western Europe, in the United States, and in Israel as well. But he talks like a leftist, which makes him seem a little less threatening to the people who historically have voted for Hugo Chavez. Now, at the election that happened on December 6, 42% of Venezuelans voted for the United Socialist Party, still, despite all the hardships. However, the rest of those voting voted for the MOOD, or the Democratic Roundtable. That's the name of the opposition party. And I spoke to a number of people who voted and were campaigning for the MOOD when I was in Venezuela, and I was actually surprised what they said. I didn't meet any of them that said, I hate socialism and I love capitalism. That's not what they said. A lot of them said, I love Chavez, I love socialism, but I'm mad at Nicolas Maduro. I'm mad at the United Socialist Party. We have problems of corruption, and yes, it's because of the U.S. Yes, we know they're dropping the oil prices, but we don't think the United Socialist Party we don't think they're handling the situation the right way. The term that was used to describe what happened was actually, they called it a voto castigo. It was a punishment vote. Basically, people weren't voting for the Democratic Roundtable because they agreed with them. They were voting against Maduro because they were upset with the situation in the country. So now the Venezuelan National Assembly is controlled by the opposition. But the opposition, the MUD, they realize that there's a big gap between the people who voted for them and themselves. And this is a big problem. And I guess a lot of people expected that when the MOOD would take office, that they would just immediately, just gradually start to kind of roll back and block Bolivarianism. But actually they haven't done that at all. They've actually seemed determined at this point to provoke some kind of civil war. The first thing that they did is in the National Assembly, there are huge portraits of Hugo Chavez But there's another portrait there also of Bolivar, who's like the national hero. He's like the George Washington, or I guess you could say the Martin Luther King Jr. of Venezuela. And the first thing they did is remove those pictures. So, you know, that's a huge, basically a declaration of warfare. If you were to take down, if a president took office in the U.S. and the first thing he did was to take down a statue of Martin Luther King Jr., people wouldn't interpret that as just, you know, a change in decoration. That would be a statement of political warfare. And the opposition has been doing that. They've been privatizing the housing programs. And Maduro, on the other hand, has actually declared an economic emergency for Venezuela, and he's started taking swift measures to get the economy back in order. The Supreme Court, which is, you know, mainly people who were elected and are aligned with the Bolivarian movement, has supported Maduro in doing this. Maduro's formed a communal parliament, which is kind of a dual government structure of people that are part of the Bolivarian process. And one thing that Maduro has done since the elections is he's actually launched a crackdown on corruption. The people that were in charge of regulating the food industry some of them have been arrested because they've been allowing these shortages to go on. So the Bolivarian movement is kind of realized that they have a lot of problems, and they're trying to rapidly fix the problem. But at this time, Maduro has the task of holding the country together. Anti-communist paramilitaries have been caught attempting to enter Venezuela from Colombia, and the opposition knows that it cannot peacefully win. Already, one of the most popular TV personalities that is a supporter of the Bolivarian Revolution was actually killed in his home. He was just shot, murdered. And there's an increasing amount of violence on the streets. And basically, Maduro is trying to hold the country together. They're trying to reduce chaos and civil war and maintain, and basically maintain Venezuela and keep the vibrant, independent economy together. Now, Nicolas Maduro and the United Socialist Party are basically, at this point, they're defenders of peace. They want to hold the country together, and they want to continue the march toward 21st century socialism. Now, I want to actually point out that, now there has been an increase in violence over the last few weeks, but the election that I witnessed in Venezuela, it was actually the first election in the last 16 years that was not followed by violence and street fighting the next day. Every time that Maduro or Chavez has won, the next day in the wealthy neighborhoods of Venezuela, people go out and burn things and blow things up and destroy public buildings, and there's violence. But for the first time now that the National Assembly was taken back by the opposition, there wasn't violence in the streets. And that should show you where the violence in Venezuelan society is coming from. We have it in our heads that Chavez is a dictator and all of that, but when the United Socialist Party lost the elections, their supporters did not go out and kill anybody. They didn't go out and burn anything. They just accepted the results and realized that they had a problem. Now, there's further evidence that there's more destabilization going on. They've caught weapons being shipped into the country, and if there were to be a war that broke out in Venezuela, this would be a disaster for the whole continent, because South America is divided between countries that are aligned with the Bolivarian Revolution and countries that are aligned with the United States. Colombia is with the United States. Ecuador is with Venezuela. Bolivia is with Venezuela. And frankly, if there were to be a war that broke out in Venezuela, this could even have global implications, because Venezuela is aligned with Russia and China. And the United States and NATO in Western Europe are aligned with the opposition in Venezuela and with countries like Colombia. So if something were to blow up, this would be a disaster for everybody. It wouldn't just be a disaster for the people in Venezuela. Among leftists in the United States, people who are activists, there's widespread ultra-left criticism of Venezuela, especially since the elections. A lot of people say, well, they should have just had a coup, they should have been like Fidel Castro and taken up the gun and just seized power and established some kind of armed military dictatorship. But in Venezuela in the 1970s and 80s, there was an armed struggle for socialism. A lot of communists and revolutionaries took up guns, and it didn't work. It wasn't successful. And Chavez first tried to take power in 1992 with a military coup, and it wasn't successful. And if you look at the history of the world, successful revolutions, while they often do involve violence, they're really acts of self-defense. True revolutionaries are not bomb-throwing fanatics and adventurers. The Russian Revolution began as an uprising all throughout Russian society for democracy. They didn't want to have a czar, they wanted to have a democratic government. And as they rose up against the czar, and they brought down the czar, they built these bodies called workers' councils, or Soviets. And then the leaders of the military in Russia tried to outlaw these Soviets, and they brought in a general called Kornilov. And Kornilov tried to establish a military dictatorship, and the Soviets defended themselves against Kornilov, and in the process created the Soviet Union, right? So this was an act of self-defense, the Russian Revolution. Or in China. In China, the communists aligned with the nationalists and other patriotic forces to fight against Japan when Japan invaded China. And the communists, the Eighth Route Army in China, were distinguished. They were known as the most heroic fighters. They were the most self-sacrificing and heroic fighters against Japan. And then after the Second World War was over, they wanted to have an election in China. They were going to have an election to elect the new government. And Chiang Kai-shek, who was aligned with the United States, outlawed the Communist Party. Even though they were one of the most popular parties in China at the time, he said the Communist Party cannot participate in the elections. And so when the Chinese Communist Party, when they went out and had demonstrations and protests demanding the right to be in the elections, the police and the military went and shot them down. So then the people of China rose up and defended themselves, and that's how we got modern China, the People's Republic of China. That's what it comes out of. The Chinese Revolution was also an act of self-defense. We can even look at the history of this country. You know, we've had two great revolutions here in this country. The first revolution was the revolution against the British Empire. The second revolution was the Civil War. We call it the Civil War, but it was really the Second American Revolution. Abraham Lincoln was elected democratically, and he was not an abolitionist. He did not want to abolish slavery, but he took power on a platform of simply restraining slavery. He said that the new states that were coming into the U.S. in the West, they were not going to be slave states. They could have slavery in the South, but the new states coming in could not be slave states. And furthermore, Abraham Lincoln said that northern states didn't have to cooperate with the fugitive slave law. If slaves escaped from the southern states and went to the north, the northern states were not obligated to arrest them and take them back to the south. That's all Abraham Lincoln said. But the slave owners were so threatened by that they took up arms and they became violent. And so Abraham Lincoln had to defend democracy by building a coalition. And it wasn't just the U.S. military. The slaves themselves all throughout the South stopped working. Probably the biggest strike we've ever had in this country was all throughout the South. Slaves stopped working and refused to work when the Civil War broke out. And labor unions, you know, the early labor movement in the factories, they mobilized their members to volunteer, and they would sing John Brown's Body and patriotically march into war. There was actually a whole section of the Union Army during the Civil War that had the red flag as their symbol. They were called the Ohio 9th Regiment. And they were immigrants from Germany who had been part of the 1848 revolt. And a lot of them were actually communists and supporters of Karl Marx who volunteered and formed a whole communist battalion. And slavery was defeated in the United States by building this broad, beautiful coalition to defend democracy against the greed of the slaveholders. That's how revolutions actually happen. Revolutions are not acts of adventurous violence. They're not people going out and saying, I'm going to force my will on society with violence. That's what extremists and fascists and right-wingers do. True revolutions begin as an act of self-defense. The Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela began as an act of self-defense. Venezuela was being gutted and destroyed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization, and the people of Venezuela rallied behind the movement for the Fifth Republic. And from the movement from the Fifth Republic, you eventually got the movement for 21st century socialism, and you got the situation that we're in today. The process through which revolutions take place and win great victories are complex. They involve millions of people gradually learning through the course of events that the change that they want will not come through maintaining the status quo. Revolutions often involve society being polarized, with burning questions dividing people and forcing people to take sides. Most importantly, revolutions require the creation of structures and institutions. We saw what happened in 2011 in the Arab Spring. There were a lot of people with hashtags going out and rebelling, but it didn't really lead to anything because there was just a hashtag. There was a lot of chaos. And yes, chaos is important, but chaos in itself does not create a revolution. In Venezuela right now, the Bolivarian movement has a very big block of supporters. 42% of the population voted for them. They have communes where people are living together and sharing things. They have labor unions. They have self-defense brigades and militias. The military is largely still supporting Maduro. They get their military training in Cuba, and Marxist classes are taught to soldiers routinely. And I think as people in the United States, we have a duty to do more than simply watch Venezuela's revolution from the sidelines as observers. We need to figure out what we can do to help Venezuela in these hard times and prevent Venezuela from breaking down into civil war. I think we need to point out that the same big banks that loot Venezuela and took control of its oil resources are also crippling the next generation here with student debt. The same government that cuts food stamps and closes hospitals and schools continues to spend billions of dollars to fund the Venezuelan opposition and fight against the Venezuelan government. The same corporations that manufacture the guns and weapons being sent to Colombia and then smuggled into Venezuela to the opposition as they gear up for some kind of civil war, they manufacture the same tear gas and bullets that are used on protesters in places like Baltimore and Ferguson. The same corporations, the same big bankers that are at war with Venezuela are also at war with the working people here in the United States. And they call us the 99% of the working people here in the U.S., we have a common enemy with the people of Venezuela and their movement. And it's important that we build these links and we stand arm in arm with our brothers and sisters in Venezuela and our brothers and sisters all throughout Latin America south of the border. We need to learn from Venezuela, and we need to think about how we can be more effective fighters for justice and peace here in the United States and around the world. That's all I've got to say. Thanks.